Okay, so picture this. I'm walking my dog, right? Through this really nice neighborhood, big houses, those perfectly manicured lawns, you know the type.
I think so, yeah.
So anyway, I'm strolling along and suddenly, brrr, soaked.
What happened? Did it start pouring?
Nope. Even worse, a sprinkler. One of those giant ones going full blast right there on the sidewalk. Drenched me, but my dog, he's got better instincts, steered clear.
Smart dog.
Turns out it was on a timer watering this homeowner's prize-winning roses that were kind of spilling out onto the public sidewalk.
Ah, see? And that's when you start to wonder.
Exactly. Who controls that little sliver of sidewalk? Do I have a right not to get soaked? It got me thinking about all the ways we take property rights for granted until something like that happens.
It's so true. And it's a perfect example of how this stuff, it's not just theoretical, it's woven into our everyday lives.
Right. So let's unravel it a bit. If I'm that homeowner, what are my actual rights when it comes to my property? And how does that play into, public access?
Well, the legal concept we're talking about here is the right to exclude. Basically, property owners get to decide who can and can't be on their property.
Sounds simple enough.
You think so, but it gets complicated quickly.
Because, my right to keep people off my perfectly manicured lawn, that doesn't necessarily extend to the public sidewalk, even if it is right next to my prize-winning roses.
Precisely. The law recognizes that this right to exclude, it's not absolute. There are limits, especially when it bumps up against other important social interests.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of limits?
Well, think about the case of State v. Shack. This farmer, he tried to stop aid workers from reaching some migrant workers living on his land. The court ultimately decided that the workers' well-being, their right to those services, outweighed the farmer's desire to control every inch of his property.
So the court recognized a greater social need that kind of trumped the typical understanding of property rights.
Exactly. And sometimes this right to exclude, it gets challenged in less, shall we say, dire situations, but that are still really thought-provoking.
Oh, like what?
Ever heard of the case, Uston v. Resorts International? It involved a blackjack player, a very skilled blackjack player, finding himself no longer welcome at the casino table.
Wait, really? I have to ask, was he just that good?
He was. He was a card counter, using his skills to beat the house. Now, you might think, a casino, private business, right. They can refuse service if they want to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But here's the twist. The New Jersey Supreme Court, they actually ruled in favor of the card counter. Their reasoning was interesting.
Okay, what was it?
They argued that, yes, casinos are private entities, but they're also businesses open to the public. And in those cases, the right to exclude has to be exercised reasonably.
Yeah.
Banning someone solely for their skill, that crossed the line.
Interesting. So it's not enough to just slap up a private property keep-out sign. There's this whole other level of legal interpretation that comes into play, especially when we're talking about businesses that are open to the public.
Exactly. And this whole idea of public access, that's where things get even more interesting when we start talking about things like, well, beaches.
Which brings us to the case of Matthews v. Bay Head Improvement Association. So this case, Matthews v. Bay Head Improvement Association, this one really got me thinking. You have a private organization, right? And they're controlling access to a beach.
Oh yeah, that Matthews case. It's a classic example of how property rights can get really tangled up with the public trust doctrine.
The public trust doctrine. Okay, break that down for me. What's that all about?
So basically it says that certain resources, things like navigable waters, shorelines, those belong to everyone. They're held in trust by the government for the public's benefit.
So even if, say, a private landowner, even if they own the land right up to the water, the public still has some inherent rights.
That's the idea. In this Matthews case, it really pushed the boundaries of that doctrine. The New Jersey court, they made a pretty big decision.
What did they decide?
They extended the public trust doctrine to cover the dry sand area of the beach above the high tide line.
Wow, so they said the public should be able to access the dry sand too, not just the wet sand.
Exactly. Which, by the way, was a different interpretation than some other states had taken. A lot of times they limited it just to the wet sand.
Interesting. What was the reasoning there? Why extend it to the dry sand?
Well, they basically said that separating the wet sand from the dry sand, it was impractical. You can't really enjoy the ocean, enjoy those public waters, without being able to actually be on the beach.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it seems kind of like a cruel joke to say, okay, you can look at the ocean, but don't you dare touch the sand.
Right. And this whole principle, it has implications that go way beyond just this one beach in New Jersey.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about it. gated communities that restrict access to, say, public lakes or parks. These all raise similar questions about how we balance private ownership with the public's right to enjoy those shared resources.
It really highlights how these legal concepts, they're not just existing in some vacuum, they really impact how we experience the world around us.
100%.
And speaking of rights and access, something that always fascinates me is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's amazing how relevant this law is even today, especially sections 1981 and 1982. They feel incredibly timely, even though they were enacted during Reconstruction.
It is pretty incredible how a law over 150 years old is still so central to these conversations. And in some ways, the 1866 Act, it actually has broader language than even the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the one we usually think of when we talk about public accommodations.
Broader. How so?
Well, the 1964 Act, that focuses on very specific categories, right? Like race, religion, national origin. But the 1866 Act, that uses the phrase make and enforce contracts.
Make and enforce contracts. Okay.
And that, my friend, has led to some really interesting debate about how it applies to more modern forms of discrimination. For example, does it cover things like discriminatory surveillance, unequal treatment in a store, even if you aren't technically denied service?
So even if I'm allowed into a store, if I'm treated differently because of my race, that could be a violation under this older law.
That's the argument some courts have made. There's a case, Chapman v. Higbee, that involved a black woman who was falsely accused of shoplifting and detained by security. And the court in that case, they took a really broad view of the 1866 Act. They said it wasn't just about the act of buying something, it was about the whole process of even trying to make a purchase.
Meaning everyone should be treated equally while shopping, regardless of their race.
Exactly. But like with a lot of legal issues, there are different interpretations. In another case, Gregory v. Dillard's Inc., that one involved black shoppers being unfairly targeted for security checks. And in that case, the court took a much narrower view.
Interesting. What did they say?
They argued the 1866 Act only applies when someone is completely blocked from buying something.
So there's still this gray area when it comes to what constitutes discrimination in places like stores?
Definitely. It's a really complex and evolving area of the law. The courts are still trying to figure out just how far those protections extend. These cases, they highlight how we're still trying to find that balance between property rights and the right to be free from discrimination.
And it makes you wonder just how often these really subtle and not so subtle forms of discrimination, how often they actually happen in our everyday lives.
It really does make you think. Have you ever felt like you were treated differently in a store? Maybe because of your race, how you were dressed, who you were with.
It's a good point.
All of these are real-world situations where these legal principles come into play, and we might not even realize it.
It reminds us that the law isn't just about abstract ideas, it's really about people's lived experiences. It's true. Makes you think about all the ways these issues pop up. And it's not just about race either. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that's a big one too.
Absolutely.
That law has done so much to make sure people with disabilities can access public spaces. But I imagine making all those reasonable modifications can get really tricky in some cases.
It can be tricky, for sure. But what's really cool about the ADA is that it's not just about, retrofitting old buildings. It sets standards for any new construction or renovations, too.
So it's more about designing with accessibility in mind right from the start.
Exactly. And there's this key phrase in the law, readily achievable.
Readily achievable, okay.
Meaning businesses have to make changes that are doable without putting a crazy amount of strain on them.
Although I imagine what's reasonable or an undue burden, that probably gets debated a lot, right?
Oh, all the time. And there's actually a really interesting case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, PGA Tour, Inc. v. Martin. It involved a pro golfer, Casey Martin, who had a disability that made it really painful for him to walk the course.
Okay, I've heard of this.
He wanted to use a golf cart during tournaments, but the PGA's rules didn't allow it.
So it became this question of, do the rules of the game have to bend to allow for someone's need for accommodation?
Right. And in this case, the Supreme Court ended up siding with Casey Martin. They said that letting him use a golf cart, that was a reasonable modification.
Interesting.
It didn't fundamentally change how the game was played, and that was a really key part of their decision.
That's a pretty powerful example of the ADA trying to strike a balance, trying to make sure people with disabilities have equal access without putting unrealistic demands on businesses and organizations.
It is.
It does make me wonder, though, what about older structures, like historical buildings,
Right.
those can be tough to modify
Right.
while still keeping their historical character. How does the ADA handle that?
It's a good question, and it's something the law takes into account. It recognizes how important it is to preserve those historic places. So when it's just truly not possible to make a historic building fully accessible, the ADA encourages businesses to come up with other solutions.
Like what?
Things like offering curbside pickup or home delivery, providing really detailed information about the building's layout so people can figure out if they'll be able to navigate it.
It's pretty amazing how the law tries to consider all these different angles.
It does. And it shows how deeply connected property rights are to so many other rights. Like, take the issue of homelessness. It's a really complex example of trying to balance a property owner's right to their space with the rights of people experiencing homelessness, who need shelter, who need basic necessities.
Oh, absolutely. That's a tough one. Legally and ethically.
It really is. There was the case, Pottinger v. City of Miami, where the court said the city couldn't punish people for basically just existing in public. Things like sleeping or eating in public, if there was nowhere else for those folks to go.
So they were saying you can't punish someone just for being homeless.
Right. But then you have a case like Tobe v. City of Santa Ana, where the court upheld a law that was much stricter. That law made it illegal to camp or store your things in public spaces.
So which one was right?
That's the thing. There's not always an easy answer. These cases show how much tension there is in trying to balance all these competing interests. We want to maintain public order, but we also need to respect the rights of our most vulnerable citizens. It's a discussion that's going to continue for a long time.
It's a lot to think about. And, this whole deep dive, it's been really eye-opening. We've covered so much ground, from beaches to casinos, historical buildings, even homelessness. Property rights really are everywhere.
They are, aren't they? And I think what's so important is that these cases, they challenge us to really think critically about property. It's not just about who owns what. It's about how those ownership rights affect our individual freedoms, our access to resources, how we all live together as a society.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. As more and more of our lives are lived in spaces that are privately owned, think shopping malls, entertainment venues, even online platforms, how do we make sure that the public still has the right to gather, to protest, to exercise their freedom of speech? It's a really important question, and one that we all need to keep thinking about. So thank you to our expert for this amazing conversation, and thank you all for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time.